The history of Germany. For most of its history, Germany did not exist as a single nation, but as a patchwork of tribes, kingdoms, and cities across Central Europe. In the first century, Germanic tribes famously destroyed 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg Forest, halting Rome's expansion and keeping the Rhine as a lasting frontier. These early tribes, described by Roman writers as fierce and independent, were organized around kinship and loyalty to individual chieftains rather than any central monarchy, and they lived through farming, cattle raising, and a strong warrior tradition that would leave lasting marks on later German culture. As Rome declined, the Franks rose to prominence, and under Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800, they built a vast Christian empire stretching across much of Western Europe, blending Germanic tradition with Roman and Christian institutions. After his death, the empire split among his heirs, and its eastern portion, distinct in language and culture from the western Frankish lands that became France, evolved into the medieval Kingdom of Germany. Before Charlemagne's rise, Germanic peoples such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths had already played a central role in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, migrating across Europe and carving out their own kingdoms from former Roman territory. While the Franks, who remained in their original homelands, built the foundation for the empire, Charlemagne would later inherit and expand. In 962, Otto I was crowned emperor, founding what became the Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of princes, bishops, and free cities that would endure for nearly 900 years without ever becoming a centralized state. Real power stayed with regional rulers rather than the emperor, a fragmentation that shaped German history for centuries, and was formalized in 1356, when the Golden Bull established that 7 prince-electors, rather than any hereditary line, would choose the emperor. Trade flourished through alliances like the Hanseatic League, connecting German cities across northern Europe and bringing enormous wealth to port cities such as Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, while emperors and popes repeatedly clashed over the balance between religious and secular authority, most famously during the investiture controversy of the 11th century. In 1517, Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church ignited the Reformation, splitting Germany along religious lines and reshaping its culture and language through his German translation of the Bible, which was rapidly spread by the newly invented printing press. Many princes embraced Protestantism partly to seize church lands and assert independence, while others remained Catholic allies of the emperor, and this rivalry led to decades of intermittent conflict, briefly settled by the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, which let each ruler determine his territory's religion. That fragile settlement collapsed into the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648. One of the most devastating conflicts in European history, drawing in Sweden, France, Spain, and Denmark, and killing perhaps a fifth to a third of the German population through combat, famine, and disease. The war ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which confirmed the sovereignty of hundreds of individual German territories and left the empire more fractured than ever. Out of this fragmentation, 2 powers rose to dominance: Habsburg Austria and Hohenzollern Prussia. Prussia, built on military discipline and efficient administration, became a major European power under Frederick the Great in the 18th century, seizing the wealthy province of Silesia from Austria and fighting off a coalition of rivals in the 7 Years' War, while Austria governed a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire that gave it considerable resources, but also created lasting challenges of internal cohesion. This rivalry between a comparatively unified, militarized Prussia and a diverse, sprawling Austria would shape German politics for the next century and eventually determine the terms of unification itself. Napoleon's conquests then swept away the old Holy Roman Empire entirely in 1806. And although French occupation was humiliating, it also sparked German nationalism and administrative reform, particularly in Prussia, where reformers abolished serfdom and modernized civil administration in response to the shock of defeat. After Napoleon's final downfall, aided by German forces at Leipzig and Waterloo, the 1815 Congress of Vienna created a loose German confederation of 39 states with no real central authority, frustrating nationalists who wanted a unified constitutional nation. Liberal hopes for unity through peaceful revolution collapsed in 1848, when a National Assembly in Frankfurt drafted a liberal constitution and offered the imperial crown to the Prussian king, who refused it as illegitimate, leaving the task instead to the calculating statesmanship of Otto von Bismarck a generation later. As Prussia's chancellor, Bismarck engineered wars against Denmark, Austria, and finally France, using each victory to isolate his rivals and rally the German states around Prussian leadership. The decisive Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871 ended in a stunning Prussian victory, the capture of French Emperor Napoleon III, and the siege of Paris, and in the flush of this triumph, German princes gathered at the Palace of Versailles, a deliberately symbolic setting to proclaim King Wilhelm I of Prussia as emperor of a newly unified German empire, ending centuries of political fragmentation and leaving a bitter memory among the French that would resurface after Germany's own defeat decades later. This new state grew rapidly into an industrial and military powerhouse, and Bismarck built an elaborate system of alliances to preserve peace while introducing pioneering social welfare programs at home. But under Kaiser Wilhelm II, who dismissed Bismarck in 1890, Germany's naval buildup and imperial ambitions unsettled its neighbors and helped trigger World War I in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain reaction among Europe's rival alliances. 4 years of brutal trench warfare, fought largely to a stalemate on the Western Front, and marked by a crippling British naval blockade at home, ended in German defeat in 1918, the Kaiser's abdication, and the harsh Treaty of Versailles, which imposed heavy reparations and territorial losses that deeply humiliated the German public. The post-war Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, struggled from the start, battered by hyperinflation that wiped out middle-class savings so completely that people needed wheelbarrows of cash for basic goods, chronic political violence from both the left and right, including an attempted Nazi putsch in Munich in 1923, and finally the Great Depression, which brought mass unemployment and renewed desperation after a brief period of stability and vibrant cultural flourishing in the mid-1920s, when Berlin became a center of experimental cinema, theater, and design through movements like the Bauhaus. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party exploited this instability, combining nationalist rhetoric with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to build a mass movement, and after being appointed chancellor in 1933, Hitler swiftly used emergency powers and the Enabling Act to dismantle democratic institutions and build a totalitarian dictatorship on extreme nationalism and racial ideology. His regime persecuted Jews and other targeted groups through escalating legal discrimination and violence, ultimately murdering 6 million Jews and millions of others in the Holocaust through an industrial system of concentration and extermination camps. Meanwhile, Hitler pursued rearmament and territorial expansion that plunged the world into World War II in 1939. Early German victories across Poland, France, and much of Western Europe, achieved through fast-moving blitzkrieg tactics, gave way to disaster after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 and the entry of the United States into the war. And following the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad and the Allied invasion of Normandy, Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945 amid total devastation and the ruin of its major cities. The defeated country was divided among the Allied powers, hardening into two rival states as the Cold War began. The democratic, Western-aligned Federal Republic of Germany, which rebuilt rapidly into a prosperous industrial economy under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and close integration with NATO and the emerging European community, and the Communist German Democratic Republic under Soviet influence, which developed as an authoritarian socialist state closely monitored by its secret police, the Stasi. Berlin itself, though located deep inside East German territory, was divided into western and eastern sectors and became a focal point of Cold War tension, most dramatically during the Soviet blockade of 1948 and 1949, which the Western powers overcame through a massive airlift. In 1961, the Berlin Wall physically divided the former capital to stop the flow of East Germans fleeing westward, becoming the era's most powerful symbol of a divided Europe and the broader Iron Curtain separating East from West.